Probably the biggest topic when talking about the socialist countries of the Eastern Bloc under the communist rule is housing. But how exactly did it work? What were the housing policies? What people had to do to get housed in the new concrete panel blocks of flats? Let's explore this, and in the background, I will build a new part of a big residential estate in our city. This is a continuation of this little sub-series dedicated to the typical panel housing. If you are interested and haven't yet seen the previous parts, we already covered how the most important input material, cement, is made, then how the concrete panels are manufactured in a prefabrication factory, and how is the panel house eventually put together. Those were the technical things, but we also already talked about why even build such houses in these kinds of layouts, and overall what were the urban ideas. Today, we start more personal perspective, and it will certainly not be all. So, let's start with some historical context. At this point, many people seem to repeat that slight misconception that panel housing was the answer to a housing shortage directly caused by the Second World War. That is simply not true by just looking at the time frame. The first serious mass panel housing estates started to appear in Central Europe, of the Eastern Bloc that is, towards the late 1950s. Not to mention that the usually shown pictures of panel prefabs are from the 1970s, when most of them were built. The most serious war damage was taken care of relatively quickly by rebuilding the original structures in cities. Then, socialist realism style arrived into Central Europe from the Soviet Union in very late 1940s, during which cities continued to be rebuilt, most notably Warsaw. And well, a bit morbid point, but very much relevant for this discussion, there were a lot of casualties in the war, so some cities lost huge parts of their populations and therefore demand for housing. Now, that is of course not to say that housing crisis was solved by mid-1950s and mass panel housing was built later just because it was cool. No, the thing with housing crises is that they basically never stop, only the main fuels for them change. More often than not, the reasons also overlap in time, and they are not the same level everywhere, in every city. So, was the direct war displacement still relevant when talking about housing shortages from mid-1950s onward? Well, saying no would not be exactly correct, but other reasons started to contribute significantly more. Even before the Second World War, there was a housing crisis, which was basically the cause for the whole debate how should modern buildings and cities be built to provide much healthier environment. Cities were still burdened by unsatisfactory living conditions, mostly from the times of the Industrial Revolution. It became obvious that people need to live better, and they clearly demanded such change, which created demand for new housing. But the pre-war projects were not answering the total demand all that well. The Second World War did not exactly help with moving towards some possible solutions, unless you count destruction, which in some cities made way for modernist rework later. So, of course, this problem remained and significantly fueled the housing demand for many more decades to come. It only toned down immediately following the war, since having some roof over your head was more important than having quality roof over your head, but demands for better housing quickly resumed. Next big problem for housing availability, probably the biggest one, was the massive industrialization and overall centralization of production, which became a huge political topic for the communists in the post-war restart, drawing money from other sectors. In some places, new housing did follow this expansion, especially in those big projects of socialist realism, like in Nová Huta Kraków, Poruba Ostrava, and the newly built cities like Eisenhüttenstadt or Dunajváros that we have already talked about before. Clearly, if you make a whole new city, then you only move in people who will have a place to stay, so it will be well balanced with jobs. Plus, it's the modern living, so a perfect showcase of how we provide housing for everyone. But that was relatively just a few projects. Overall situation in especially bigger cities was pretty much the opposite. People were moving towards the newly established jobs, some people were fleeing collectivization of farms, plus there was that strong post-war baby boom. Something like long-distance everyday commute from the countryside or smaller towns was just not practical, so new city housing was desperately needed. But its construction was initially very slowly following this development, and this can be attributed to the change in leadership. Just like with industry, suddenly, forcibly, things had to be done differently, more cleanly, according to the new ideology. So existing practices in housing expansion were discontinued and came under almost full control of the state. New housing would be planned and financed by it only. But it soon became very clear that satisfying the partially self-inflicted shortage is too much for the states to handle. One example of how serious the situations became were the 1953 East German riots, where one demand of protesters was exactly to solve the unbearable housing situation. One thing the states did to partially fix this was to establish an average area norm, which in Czechoslovakia was around 8 square meters. If someone had spare 8 square meters in their flat, then they would be assigned new flatmates. This policy actually remained all the way until 1989. States were able to do this since practically all flats were nationalized and in possession of the state, while the original owners were only given deeds for permanent use. This process was already heavily corrupt, so there were ways to secure larger space or prevent random people being shoved into your home. That is roughly the late 1950s, and that is when prefabricated concrete panel houses left their pilot projects and arrived en masse to begin solving this mess. Plus, certain policies began changing regarding financing and owning of new housing. There were practically 3 types of new blocks of flats built: owned directly by the state, specific companies, or housing cooperatives. State development was straightforward. Cities identified suitable places for construction, and state provided funds. Administrator was then the local government. But this type of construction was not particularly favorable for the state, as all responsibility, both regarding funding and quality of the housing, was on the state. Also, nationalized old flats were state flats, so maintenance responsibility was on it too. It also meant that when demolitions took place for new construction, it was the state that had to provide another state housing for the displaced people. Company development was the kind of housing built by the individual companies for their workers. Depending on the country and time period, funds came from the company directly or from the state again, since during some times companies were banned from keeping profits, so could not invest. Housing cooperatives were a little more complicated. In general, a housing cooperative is an entity. You can think of it here as a non-profit organization. Making profit off housing was of course strictly banned under communist leadership. The housing co-op owns and manages all of its properties, and back in these times it was also responsible for building very significant amount of housing. In Czechoslovakia, at its peak in the late 1960s, half of all new housing was built by housing co-ops. Funds for this construction came from its members and only partially from the state in the form of very favorable loans. Land would be given to the co-op for free, usually, and it would also receive help with the construction process. This was basically a way for the state to get rid of some responsibility for new housing and financially engage other parties into the difficult process of solving the housing shortage, mainly the future tenants. Housing co-ops are nothing new. They existed well before the Second World War, but in the early communist years, their power was severely limited and could not contribute much new housing. Their popularity rose again as regimes realized they will need them, so late 1950s, together with the rise of panel housing. In a way, it was a little free market approach, as the housing co-op would build according to the number of new members. However, in certain time periods and with certain co-ops, they would be more centrally controlled and basically just became construction companies commanded by the state, having to fulfill new housing quotas as per the economic plan. They could also not form freely, but were created by local authorities or merged from existing ones into centralized co-ops for whole cities or regions. The specific housing estates would also not be freely chosen, planned, or expanded by either co-ops or companies, and it was possible in very large residential developments that followed a single plan to have buildings belonging to all 3 subjects. And now finally for the main point, how were people able to secure a new flat? The most straightforward way would be to become employed in a company that maintained its own housing fund. That was mostly the case for very large factories, power plants, or coal mines, for example. Also, the military, police, or some parts of the government had their own flats. And of course, higher rank meant higher chance of getting one. But companies did not need to have place for every single worker, so they would prioritize the ones working there longer, having some sort of achievements, or they would establish a waiting list. Corruption and political ties also played a role here. Next, there was the state housing. It had the advantage of not being tied to working in one company, plus it was very cheap to rent and did not require any initial payment, which was the same for company flats. But it was also probably the most difficult to obtain, since there were not that many. People needed to enter waiting lists and wait until they were assigned a flat. This waiting time, similarly to cars, was quite ridiculous. Depending on the city, it could have been even 20 years. People were scored based on all kinds of criteria, especially what was their current living condition. If they lived in a flat where individuals did not have the average floor area for themselves, they would score higher, so mostly households with newborns. On the other hand, if you lived on a larger area, you had close to zero chance for a new flat. Once again, the process of moving in the waiting list was heavily corrupt. It was usually just individuals or small committees who decided on the order, so these were bribed very often. Being politically active in the communist parties moved people up as well, or when having higher connections. Just for illustration, apparently in Czechoslovakia, the most common white-collar crime was exactly related to securing housing, so bribing the officials, illegally trading flats, and so on. The third option was through the housing co-op, but this requires some more explanation. As I said, a housing co-op has members. If you wanted to get a new co-op flat, you must have been a member of that co-op, and in order to become one, you had to pay upfront up to around 1/3 of the final price of that flat. Rest would be paid in rent. So that was very expensive for a lot of people, although I should note here that since co-ops were non-profit, it was basically just the actual construction cost. People were able to apply for a housing loan, and countries had various special loans, for example for newlyweds, new parents, and so on. If the co-op had an empty flat, you would be moved in immediately, but more often than not, you would enter another waiting list. Heavily depending on the city though, it would be significantly lower compared to the state construction, but apparently around 1970 in Prague, it was between 8 to 12 years, so not particularly fast either. This was sometimes a little circumvented when parents signed their kids into the co-op when they were still little, so the time would pass during their childhood. Although this was only possible for relatively wealthy families, as parents had to pay that sign-in fee up front. The waiting lists were also not free from corruption. Flat in a housing co-op had several disadvantages. You of course did not own it, it was owned by the co-op, even though you paid for it. If you moved away, then you would lose your co-op membership and with it your payments, and you would receive only the remaining membership value. It was only possible to exchange flats with other members of the same co-op. The rent or payment of the remaining value could have also been higher than the very low rent in state or company flats. The advantage was that the flat was kinda sorta more certain compared to state or company living. State could have kicked you out for various reasons from a state flat, and you could not live in a company flat if you stopped working at that company. Housing co-op buildings and their surroundings were also noticeably more maintained, since people apparently had stronger relationships with the place. It was also possible that a co-op would engage its members in the actual construction process, or just some finishing works. People would basically pay for and physically build their own flats, on top of going to a regular job. Some co-ops were then basically indistinguishable from a regular construction company with its own workforce. Some of those kinds of co-ops would actually use their members to build other people's homes, which was not exactly liked. Another form of housing that I want to mention only on the side, since it's not related to concrete panel housing, was full personal ownership. Yes, that was possible during the communist times too. Those were mostly the single-family houses or various small cottages, holiday homes, and those kinds of things. People were able to build and own them. They were even under certain conditions wanted by the state, since it was just another way to house people and depressurize the state and co-op demand. this time shifting initial financing on the final owner completely. Several types of simple houses were created, for example in Hungary the Kadar cube, named after the Hungarian leader of the time, in Czechoslovakia a little fancier house called Šumperák, or in East Germany a prefabricated wooden system called Okal. Some of these types then crossed borders. At least in Czechoslovakia, if you wanted to build your own house, you were given very favorable conditions if you used selected standardized, basically catalog, designs. You were then also able to order local construction companies. Otherwise, you had to build it on your own, which was the most common way of building houses or doing refurbishments. This individual construction was also the reason for large-scale material thievery, when people stole bricks, bags of cement, bathtubs or radiators from big construction sites or factories directly. But people also stole materials for various refurbishments of flats, either due to shortages, but also just to save money, in the spirit of who doesn't steal from the state, steals from the family. In case of demolitions of this private property because of new construction, it depended on the individual deals. Someone would receive new state flat, some people could even strike a deal for an exchange of new plot of land. So, those were the ways how people could secure their place to live in during the communist times. Contrary to the popular polarized belief that housing was super affordable, available to everyone, and every household lived on their own, the actual situation was more complex than that. And also, the housing shortages were certainly not totally fixed during the whole communist era. Does that mean things were totally terrible and everything done was wrong? No. Do I imply that things are basically perfect today? Also no. Come on. Anyway, this is where I also wrote another 5 pages of script for the living conditions, some kind of personal perspective of living in the panel house. And actually, this was just supposed to be an introduction to the living conditions, since I found it fitting to start with how a person even got into the panel house. But the previous video was 8 pages long, and I almost ran out of time-lapse for the background there. So let's keep the living conditions for some other time, and maybe I will actually make it more thorough thanks to that. It's not going to be the very next one though, I have some other plans for that. But anyway, let's now go into our city and see what I'm building. So, as you could have seen, we moved into that oldest post-war district that was started to be built in the socialist realism style in 1950s, early to mid 1950s. But socialist realism ended before it could be finished in that style, which is common for a lot of these kinds of projects in Central Europe. So it was continued with the prefabricated panel houses in the 1960s. And in this particular case, we are just continuing it in the 1970s as well. So in those 1960s, I mostly got inspired by the Poruba district in Ostrava, where I just wanted to continue some kind of block style, and just like in that area in real life, so that is roughly like early 1960s. And now we are continuing it with much more modernist looking layout from the 70s, maybe like mid to, well, actually probably late 70s, because I am using these kinds of hexagonal, well actually no, they are more like octagonal, yes, octagonal blocks that can be found in these kinds of late 1970s, but actually even 1980s projects. And also these shorter houses that I'm doing right here, they're also already starting to show some resemblance of blocks, even though not following streets, but still some kind of blocks with these kinds of inner yards. So that is exactly that somewhat more late modernist approach to these kinds of layouts. It's obviously completely something different compared to the rest of the layout of this district, which is also something that can be seen in these kinds of districts in real life. So, you know, that's just following some kind of real life examples. Now, anyway, so I am using these German prefabricated houses because, well, they are just the best looking that I have by far. They are made by Meister Monis. I did place some differently looking buildings compared to that largest residential area on the other side of the river from here. And the reason is obviously so that there's some kind of difference, because this is kind of like a distant place from that different place. And even, well, actually, no, they are kind of built simultaneously, you know, in these kinds of time periods. So I could have used the exact same houses, but I just wanted to use something slightly different. They are very similar still. I think they are even the same systems, but they just more favor this like reddish, brownish color, like brick kind of color on the panels. So, you know, it's just something a little bit more unique. Not much, but slightly. So yeah, I used those tall buildings for those octagon shapes. I intentionally did not really close them. I really did not want to create those like closed blocks. That would be maybe more typical for the later 80s, mid to late 80s. But here they are just seemingly more randomized in these kinds of shapes. But like I said, they are already starting to show signs of these blocks. So there are a couple of these places, for example, in Prague, I think in Ostrava actually, even though not in Poruba, in a different estate. I think I've seen them in Poland as well. I'm just assuming that they are going to be in different countries too. Now, this area is difficult. So usually I'm trying to build these prefabricated panel houses on flat terrain for obvious reasons. They are huge and they kind of require that terrain. They don't need to be built on flat terrain in real life. And there are actually some interesting variations of them in real life where you can, for example, have them like tiered, where you might even have the entrance, and on the entrance you might have some houses on the left side but cellars on the right side, for example, because it's like in like a sloped area and the prefab is built like perpendicular to the contour lines, yeah, if you understand what I mean. That's actually a very difficult construction from the construction process perspective, because like I explained in that construction process video, there needs to be some sort of a crane line parallel to that house. So obviously if it's going into the slope, then that's not exactly favorable, and a lot of designs, a lot of layouts of these areas were done so that that's exactly what needs to be avoided. Although you can also find pictures where the crane lines were built in these slopes, where they were obviously not built so that the crane would go up and down, no, but there would be just some kind of excavated ground for it, or, you know, partially excavated on one side and just like made higher with some concrete panels on the other side. So it was possible, although it was not exactly favorable, of course. It was a little bit more difficult than that. But in some places in real life, there was just no other way, because there was that sloped area and some cities just did not have flat places. So, you know, they had to make do with what they had. So that's kind of this place. In City Skylines, this is really difficult to put together because, well, these houses are obviously intended for flat terrain. So I was making heavy use of the mod that I started using recently, that is building control, which allows you to place houses, most importantly for my needs, without the pavement below them, which is important for these houses specifically because they are not meant to be placed on the sides of roads, right? That's kind of the main point of modernist layouts, that streets don't exist. So there is this free placement. But that means that I need to reconstruct all these pedestrian paths towards the houses, and the pavement underneath would just get in the way. I would have to get rid of it with a surface painter, but that's just a lot of work, and it also gets rid of the pavement on the side of the streets. So I have to then reconstruct it. It's just a lot of work, a lot of headache. So this is just so much simpler, so much easier with building control. And on top of that, I can use building control to get rid of that flattening behavior. So I can actually just place a couple of these houses down and the terrain is just going to nicely flow around them. So even these slopes are going to remain. So in City Skylines, that's kind of a problem, especially with some footprints of buildings, because they are just much wider than the actual structure. So they are going to flatten the ground much more. So I tend to just turn it off these days with those kinds of buildings. It's of course still much easier to just build it on flat terrain regardless, because then you have to be creative with those pedestrian paths. So you could have seen me, for example, build those stairs on some of those pedestrian connections, and I still had to do the terrain so that some windows of those houses on the first floors or something were, you know, kind of half in the terrain. So that's obviously not realistic at all. That would be just excavated somehow. Maybe some retaining walls would be there here and there, but the terrain mesh in City Skylines 1, that is kind of rough for these kinds of small details. So you know, I just had to do it somehow, and it's okay, really, in the end. I paid attention to make it so that those octagon shapes are going to like keep some kind of roof level. So I was making some of those buildings like sunken in the terrain, because that's actually something that you can see in Prague in some of these octagon designs, because there is also like slightly sloped terrain, but the roof level is kept pretty much constant, and it's just done by just cutting a couple of floors of the houses that are built on that higher terrain. So that's exactly what I was doing over here. I was even then using, to complete that octagon shape, the actually shorter buildings. They are looking slightly differently, and they are shorter because I only have these, what is that, 12 floor variant, and then I have just 5 floor variant, right? So there is obviously going to be some step between them. But still, I think I managed to keep some reasonable roof level in this area, except for maybe some of these towers, even though I think they are also 12 floors, so they might be exactly the same as those linear sections in the octagons. But anyway, on the side of this estate, especially in the hills, yeah, you can see that there on the left, I placed those Šumperák buildings. So those are the Czechoslovak, somewhat actually fancy looking single family houses. They have like a garage on the first floor and the living area on the top floor with this like a main balcony and a huge window facing south usually, or west, because of sunlight. So I exactly placed them like that on that hillside. So they are even like tiered so that all of those balconies are just facing like a beautiful view, you know, relatively. I'm still looking into this prefabricated panel estate, but also behind it, the river and some, you know, forests and all that. So that's actually looking okay. I was inspired by some rows of similar buildings, not exactly these. These were maybe not used in these kinds of configurations in real life, in these like row houses like that, but I just don't have anything better, yeah? So I just use those. And in real life, you can find like 70s, 80s projects that are just like that. I think there are a couple of them in Brno that are exactly built on a hill so that these different streets can just look over each other, yeah? But they also have like little gardens next to them. I did not really bother detailing that. It's just something on the side, just because, you know, I was talking about it. So might as well just, you know, build it as well. Now, at this particular place, because I was building it for that living conditions, you know, commentary, I built it to resemble like a very freshly finished construction site. So I even included some kind of like panels still laying on the ground, and like a crane being disassembled, you know, ready to be moved out, and some kind of those like temporary like workers' offices, and just piles of sand everywhere and these kinds of things. And I did not plant any trees in that fresh area, because of course those would be planted last when everything was cleared and there was just space for them. So I was just trying to illustrate that this is pretty much how it looked when people moved in first, and it kind of remained like that for quite some time before the finishing works would be done. But I don't really want to get into that, because I'm going to just dedicate an entire video for the actual living conditions. It's just, you know, me explaining the motivations behind this project. Anyway, so we are done with finishing the older district. We only have that huge residential district that needs to be finished. And I suppose that there are just, you know, a lot of places around it that needs to be finished. So plenty of opportunities to talk about all kinds of things related to the panel housing still. And of course, I'm going to continue building the prefabs in the 80s as well. And oh yeah, by the way, this is the last episode from the 70s. We are going to start the 80s next time. And I would like to start it with maybe some industry, talking about the economy and these kinds of introduction things for the 80s. I think it might be fitting. But I was also thinking of doing a rework of the racing circuit. But as an introduction to the 80s, the industry is probably going to be better. Anyway, that is going to be all for this Altengrad video. Hope you liked it. Hope you maybe learned something new. And if you did, then you know the drill. Do all the clicking and writing and subscribing below the video. And huge thanks to the channel members who decided to directly support what I do here. So big thanks again. Take care. Goodbye.